One of the most notable leaders of the civil rights movement was Martin Luther King Jr. His moral stature, values, character, and integrity helped to energize a mass movement toward gaining civil rights for African Americans or descendants of slaves within the United States. Because of his efforts, significant pieces of legislation were passed that not only benefited African Americans but all people of color. These pieces of legislation included the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in employment and public accommodations based on race, color, religion, or national origins. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which restored and protected the right to vote, which was significant for African Americans within the United States Southern region. The Immigration and Nationality Services Act of 1965, which allowed immigration from groups other than those from the traditional European nations, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which banned housing discrimination for sales or rentals. It's important to note that Dr. King was not a politician. He had to utilize politicians who were in places of power in order to impact change for the African American community. So when he went to meet with these people, he went with a purpose. Dr. King may have given the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, but he knew he lived in a reality where the majority of America was not in favor of equal rights for African Americans. He was never naive about the reality of that fact. And the more and more that Dr. King pushed for economic freedom and equality for African Americans, the more and more it became evident that white America would do everything that it could to hinder that progress.
And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we are getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Do you think white people in this country, and I'm talking about non-segregationists, people devoid or thinking they're devoid of racism, do you have any idea of what they want the Negro to be in America?
Well, it depends on the level that we are talking here. Because I think you have to make a distinction between the people who are genuinely and absolutely committed in the white community on the question of racial equality. And I must confess that I think they're in a very small minority. I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far It's a kind of installment plan for equality, and they are always looking for an excuse to go but so far.
It's sad to see that Senator Raphael Warnock doesn't understand what Dr. King fought for and eventually the reason why he was taken from us. The Sunday before the day of remembering Dr. King's legacy, Warnock invited President Biden into Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, where not only Dr. King, but his father and father before him presided as ministers, into the pulpit. This was a huge embarrassment to the legacy of Dr. King and to the African American community. Biden has proven to be racist through his work as a senator within the United States Congress. His friendships with proven racists such as Byrd and Strom Thurmond, and even now as President of the United States. Biden has even gone out of his way to disrespect the assassination of Dr. King and its impact upon the United States and the entire world by comparing it to George Floyd.
But even Dr. King's assassination did not have the worldwide impact that George Floyd's death did.
Biden showed his racism from the very beginning of his tenure within the United States Congress by befriending and working with racists such as Senator Byrd on anti-busing laws.
Being north versus south, that's not the issue. It is rural versus urban. And most of the busing that's taken place to date has taken place in rural areas, whether it's be administratively ordered or court ordered. Now we're moving into applying the same standards to urban areas. And it is a standard that doesn't make sense. It doesn't apply. It doesn't hold. We're moving from trying to, in urban areas, we've had integrated facilities but segregated neighborhoods. And in rural areas, we've traditionally had integrated neighborhoods but segregated facilities. And they've applied the same standard and the same test. So this north-south thing is not really the issue. As Professor Nathan Glazer at Harvard has indicated, as Dr. Armour of the Rand Corporation, as James Coleman, as I just held 3 days of hearing, two days of hearings in the Judiciary Committee on another bill I have, beyond this that deals with busing. And there is uniform opinion of those who testified that it is not a north-south, it's an urban-rural question, a distinction.
But no matter what your intent, there are going to be those who say it's a segregated thing, it's a question of race, and that you have set back the movement of desegregation of schools. How would you answer that?
The way I answer that is I predict that the young black leadership of America will overwhelmingly decide with me. I predict that in 1980 and 84, my position will be totally vindicated by the sociologists and by the civil rights advocates. I come from that side of the track. That's where I'm from. I was a defense lawyer. I handled civil rights cases. I sat in on Route 40. I'm not from the other side of this. And I happen to think that the one way to ensure that you set the civil rights movement in America further back is to continue to push busing, because it's a bankrupt policy. And that's why I think I'll be vindicated.
You said on the floor that you believe that the court should have the power to decide on busing.
Not only did Biden work with racist Senator Strom Thurmond on the crime bill, but he also loved and respected this man as a mentor.
Of other severe penalties.
Back when Bill Clinton's crime bill passed, Joe Biden was such an outspoken supporter, he said, quote, "I'd like to be running and have someone use the crime bill against me."
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. Unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created.
For those of you who question whether or not Biden is actually racist, now realizing what racism looks like, here's a clip of him in an interview touting how Delaware was a slave-owning state, basically saying, I can fit in with the best of the Confederates.
Finally, we got about 30 seconds left, but I can't let you go without some politics. As we mentioned, you're in South Carolina right now on the campaign trail. 30 seconds or less. What kind of a chance would a northeastern liberal like Joe Biden stand in the South if you were running in Democratic primaries against Southerners like Mark Warner and John Edwards?
Better than anybody else. And you don't know my state. My state was a slave state. My state is a border state. My state is the 8th largest black population in the country. My state is anything from a northeast liberal state.
So, unfortunately, certain members of the African-American community and the black community are all and it was because of the black vote that Biden actually won the presidential election. Remember this clip? Because it didn't age well. Since his election, Biden has proven every way he can that he despises the African-American community and blacks overall by passing legislation that gives billions of dollars to the resettlement of Afghan refugees, by giving billions of dollars to Native American tribes, most of which probably qualify as $5 Indian settlements, by giving billions of dollars for the care and welfare of illegal immigrants who enter illegally into the United States of America, passing an anti-hate bill for the Asian community right after stating that the George Floyd's death was more significant than that of Dr. Martin Luther King, as well as protections and provisions for other groups, including immigrants who are yet to be citizens. As of late, he's promised $55 billion to African nations, but not one dime toward reparations for American descendants of slaves who built the wealth of the United States. In fact, he even stated privately that we could forget about talking about reparations. But behind closed doors, he was preparing to give reparations to illegal immigrant families, 450,000 apiece, as a matter of fact. And the cherry on top is that in the latest $1.5 trillion budget bill, he's giving yet another $45 billion to a foreign nation, being Ukraine, making it an estimated $100 billion that they've given to a foreign nation, a nation with strong neo-Nazi ties and interests. Senator Warnock has not only embarrassed himself, but he's embarrassed the legacy of Ebenezer Baptist Church and its ties to the Civil Rights Movement, inviting a man who offered crack pipes to the African American community into the church. The level of disrespect that Biden has levied against the African community as a whole is insurmountable. Warnock basically allowed the fox into the henhouse, and the house is completely in disarray. Give me your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.